So the first thing to say is that the underlying connectivity which we're all striving towards is bringing real social and economic benefits. You can look just in terms of broadband access revenues, both fixed and mobiles. It's about 0.6% of the Russian GDP last year. Of course, the more people that we can connect, the more we can get them consuming, the more hopefully we can bolster that. But it's also the other services that are enabled by that connectivity that become important. So last year, it was about $9 billion added to the Russian economy just through things like TV, and also newer services that are going to grow as we move forward. So that figure includes M2M, but if you think of the expansion of IoT, think of all the vertical sectors that we were hearing about earlier on this morning, you can see that number is only going to grow. Lots of economic studies have been conducted into this. So if you look at an ITU study from a couple of years ago, every 10% of broadband penetration leads to 0.2 percentage points increase in GDP growth. So for last year, that would have equated to a further $3.3 billion. If you put it in those sorts of terms, this is real money we're talking about here. And just a couple of examples of what the digital economy can enable. Now, this is an African example. It's a very famous example, M-Pesa. But the numbers involved here are quite interesting. 23 million people across 11 countries, 2,000 businesses using it to collect bills, 45,000 retailers in Kenya and Tanzania alone are accepting payments through this system. And now you can also build upon that platform, and it offers loans and business insurances that never really had before. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the government is paying salaries and benefits through this platform. So it's not, for me, I think the point I'm trying to make here is that broadband connectivity is a platform on which so much more can be delivered as well. And it's not just economic benefits, there are social benefits as well. In last year's Estonian parliamentary elections, 20% of the votes were actually cast online. So e-government services are really popular. Some surveys that we've conducted among consumers globally have shown that 80% of people in China and India want some sort of e-health system or service. Similar proportion in Indonesia and the Philippines, looking for educational services as well. So again, the point here is that actually we're talking about a platform here that enables so much more. But like all good things, there are some obvious barriers to overcome, what we call the 4 A's. I'm going to concentrate today around availability, but it's also important to note affordability across the network, the device, and the application is also important. But also as well, those softer issues. So making people aware of what is possible online, overcoming digital literacy gaps at one end. At the other end of the scale, we also have the high-end knowledge base, the computer scientists that are able to deliver the benefits of things like big data analytics. A country has to have both ends of those scales closed off. When we talk about broadband connections, a lot of national broadband plans to date have concentrated on the availability of broadband, just making broadband available. There's a sort of binary decision. But actually, as we're moving forward through this century, this decade as well, the discussion has changed more towards the capability of that connectivity. The availability obviously is increasing, it is improving, we're hearing a lot about that, but actually improving the capability of that broadband is particularly important. And why is that important? Well, the chart here is taken from a survey that we conducted of 15,000 consumers worldwide. And you can see that when you look at the sort of plateauing, I suppose, of customer satisfaction, it occurs around about the 20 megabits per second level. That's roughly what we're aiming at. Once people have that level, they're able to consume. In this instance, it's the video, which is obviously very network intensive. So it's a very good barometer of what it is that people are expecting to use and consume on their network, and the responsiveness of that network. They want a network that can respond in less than 3 seconds. In fact, I would argue, particularly when we're talking about some of the 5G usage cases, we're talking about incredibly low latencies as well. And I would just reiterate as well, this isn't just about video. The example we have here is on video because we've got some data on it. But if you think of things like e-education, which can use real-time video, e-health, again, which can use real-time video as well. This isn't just about consuming Netflix at home, but it is about adding some of those societal benefits as well. Policy, more generally, has a very large role to play in overcoming these 4 barriers. And as I say, there's a long list of things here that can be done, from closing skill gaps to cybersecurity, for example, and privacy laws. But focusing on that connectivity piece again, one of the fundamentals is setting basic and high-speed broadband targets, and actually is making sure that that is technology neutral, that the network operators, the network providers are able to deliver that service as effectively and as efficiently as possible. And to that end, in terms of boosting that capability and availability, certainly quickly, mobile has a really, really crucial part to play in bridging that digital divide. Clearly, the costs, the civil engineering costs, are just lower, and it enables you to roll out more quickly as well by putting up a base station as opposed to digging up roads. But actually, I think a point that is often missed with rolling out mobile broadband is that actually it can be a temporary solution. It can be a way of providing availability to areas that are currently underserved while technologies like fibre are being deployed, and obviously that's a slightly longer deployment scenario. There are other areas as well around pricing regulation, wholesale regulation, and taxation as well that can be really important in overcoming affordability as well to the end users. But I think it's also useful to remind them that the government has a very large publicity machine that it can use to simply raise awareness that this is something that you can be doing. As I already mentioned, closing the low and high-end skills gap is something that actually businesses, governments, and actually the service providers all need to work together to do. And that's a really important point, in working together. All the stakeholders here that we've mentioned, it all has to be aligned to make sure that the networks are in place to deliver the applications that the country as a whole wants to optimise. So Ovum has been benchmarking 200-odd markets around the world to understand, well, where are we in this discussion? Where do each of the markets stack up? And the figures you see here relate to Russia's ranking on that scale. The white ones are the regional ranking within Europe, and the red ones are the global ranking. And you can see that in terms of the ranking, that Russia has been dropping behind and stabilised, and we expect it to pick up. But actually, if you consider that ranking against the GDP ranking, it was 9th in 2013, you can see that Russia's broadband connectivity isn't quite where I would imagine it would want to be. Now, the important thing here is that this index emphasises the access to and the migration rates to high-speed broadband. So in this instance, actually, we're talking about anything over 10 megabits per second. And it's here where Russia actually has more work to do. So if we look at the fixed broadband market for a second, actually, in terms of absolute numbers, Russia's the second largest fixed broadband market in Europe after Germany. And just over half of households have access to fixed broadband in 2015. 40% of those are on high-speed services as well. All sounding very positive. However, we know that year-on-year subscriber growth is beginning to slow. So in 2012, it was 18%. Last year, it had fallen to 4%. And the reason for that is that very often these high-speed services are delivered to urban areas. They're becoming saturated. So, of course, the growth rates are slowing. Now, what we have here on the left-hand side is a chart showing the broadband speed, or subscriptions by broadband speed. And you can see in total, Russia is lagging behind some of those other markets, which I've essentially pulled out the G7, the BRIC nations, and South Korea, because it's such an extreme case. But you can also see that red bar there, that 30 to 100 megabits per second, is proportionally quite large, and we'll come back to that in a second. On the mobile side, 3G coverage penetration is actually pretty good. Multiple SIM ownership and device penetration mean that it's difficult to get a pure population penetration in actual terms. But we think that 3G penetration is pretty high within Russia. But again, going back to that point of high-speed broadband, it's 4G where Russia is currently lacking. And a lot of that falls back onto the fixed broadband discussion as well. If you don't have the fixed infrastructure in place, it's very difficult to backhaul a 4G base station. And we saw here in February, there was a couple of regions where 2.6 gigahertz spectrum licenses remained unsold, and part of that was around getting the backhaul to those regions. And I mentioned about the high speed sort of broadband availability for the wireline market, and actually Russia comes up very well comparatively to other markets where fixed or high-speed broadband services are available. So this is a survey of Russian consumers on the top left here, and actually about a third of them are coming up at about 50 to 100 megabits per second. That's the service that they're at least buying. At the same time, when you look at the top right here, the satisfaction is very high, over 90% satisfaction in terms of the performance, in terms of the reliability, in terms of the setup and the value for money. People who have it think it's great. And on the bottom here, we've got kind of the other side of that story, which is we've got LTE availability by region, and you can see clearly there are going to be some regions where there isn't a great deal of competition. You haven't got all operators available in every region. And in the Far East, there are some areas still dependent on satellite. But again, in terms of how Russia is doing well, affordability trends very well against other markets. So this is against 19 leading markets around the world. And on the left-hand side, we've got the fixed broadband pricing. And you can see the best fit line there, and Russia is well below that. So for the broadband speeds that are being delivered, or at least advertised here, these are the advertised speeds, I will hasten to add. But in terms of those advertised speeds, it's relatively cheap. Similarly, the cost per gigabyte of data is very low on the right-hand side for mobile. And when we come to the regulatory environment, Ovum has a methodology for scoring the regulatory regimes within different markets. And what we've done here is pulled out the large 5 European markets and benchmarked it against Russia on a couple of areas. It's quite a complicated methodology, so I'm not going to dwell on that. I'm conscious of the time. But you can see that the scores, the higher the score, the stronger the regulatory regime. In terms of the institution and regulatory frameworks and spectrum policy, Russia is doing okay. There's some ground to be made up, but it's not doing too badly. And if we look behind those two scores, there are a couple of areas where the scores would be bumped up. So we have the Independent National Regulation Authority, we've got the appeals process, we've got progress towards meeting the National Broadband Plan. Now, Russia started slightly later than some of these other markets, so it's catching up, but there's still some work to do there as well. In terms of the spectrum policy, a couple of areas just to pull out. The 700 megahertz band for LTE, obviously long range, fewer base stations. That's quite cost effective in terms of serving unserved areas. Also useful for narrowband IoT as well, so serving machines. And spectrum caps to make sure that we've got fair resource allocation, and again, boosting competition. So in summary, I think it's safe to say that connectivity brings very wide-reaching social and economic benefits, but those 4 A's, those 4 barriers need to be addressed across the network, across the device and application areas for a full digital transformation of the economy. And within that, particularly the access side of things, capability is becoming increasingly important. As we've seen, policy has a huge role to play across many areas. And also, Russia is currently lagging behind in high-speed broadband access. But where it's available, it's very affordable, and the performance of the network is being very well received by users. So just to finish up, a couple of suggestions, if I may. Reiterating the point that mobile access is key to delivering to those unserved areas quickly. But you have to have the wireline coordination to go alongside it, if only for the backhaul, but you can use that temporarily, you could use the fixed line longer term to make sure that you've got that high-speed access. Boosting the local competition and reducing the capex burden, I think are very useful options here. So network sharing to protect against any capex drain, local loop unbundling to boost competition in fixed broadband, 4G national roaming to ensure that we've got nationwide competition. And from a regulatory perspective, making sure that the negotiations between the Ministry of Defence and operators to free spectrum run as smoothly as possible. We have heard stories of spectrum being unused, even though it's been purchased, because it's very difficult to negotiate the release of that spectrum. Making sure that coverage obligations really are met, and it's not just a few base stations strategically placed to make sure that a town centre is covered. And quality of experience data, quality of service data being published enables consumers to compare and contrast different networks. And it's also about making sure that that capability is being pushed forward. And finally, releasing the 700 megahertz spectrum, boosting that 4G coverage, but also, as I say, offering that opportunity for narrowband IoT. So on that note, I will finish up. Thank you very much. Thank you.